Thank you very much, Dean Kite, for your remarks. We're very grateful that you're here. My name is Jacob Ewing, as Professor Jacobson introduced just a bit earlier, and I'm excited to introduce our first spotlight. These are kind of bite-sized, succinct presentations that present innovative and burgeoning research that's relevant to migrant and refugee mental health. And our first is going to explore psychedelic-assisted treatments. Migrants and refugees often report being exposed to high levels of stress before, during, and following their journeys. As a result, this population is disproportionately diagnosed with high levels of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, among other illnesses. Despite this increased need, migrants and refugees are actually less likely than other populations to receive the care that they need. Dr. David Roberson, who is going to join us here, will tell us a little bit more about the use of psychedelic drugs to meet the therapy needs of migrants and refugees and to improve their long-term mental health. So Dr. Roberson, I'll turn it over to you.
You guys hear through the mic? Great. Thank you, Jacob and Dean Kite, for your introduction and your words, and really enjoying the panel and honored to be here. David Roberson, and my background is in drug development, in particular developing pain drugs, and grew up in Oklahoma and spent about 12 years here in the Boston area doing my PhD work at Harvard, and then postdoctoral training and work in the drug development space thereafter. I'm going to start with just a little background. Hold on just a minute. I'm not getting this clicker to work, so if you guys can just advance it manually, and I'm going to look on here to make sure I'm with you. So just a really quick history of psychedelics as they've been used historically by indigenous groups. They've been used therapeutically, or I should say ceremonially, for thousands of years in just about everywhere where people live. So iboga is a root, a small shrub that grows in Gabon, Cameroon, the Congo, and it has psychedelic properties that, like psilocybin and mescaline, which are in the other two plants listed here, they produce a profound spiritual experience and a profound awareness of self, and really have this long history of being extremely important as part of the spiritual life and the social life of the people in the places where these plants have grown. My own personal interest in psychedelics came as a child. I grew up in Oklahoma, and like a lot of white folks that have really deep ties to Oklahoma, my great-grandmother grew up in Indian territory and passed along some cultural uses of psychedelic plants, including peyote, which she used topically for pain. And so when I was doing my PhD and studying pain, I sort of recognized and realized, as we know in the field, that all of the pain drugs on the market today, and all the whether things you can buy over the counter or approved by the FDA for prescription use, are derived ultimately from natural products. And so remembering back to my childhood and some of these stories that I heard, I got really interested in the potential for using peyote topically for pain, but also spiritually, or I should say, medicinally. And so I dug into this and wanted to go to my PhD advisor and see if I couldn't convince him to let me study peyote. And like any good student, I go to the next slide. I went to the library and started digging up everything I could, and I found a 1938 undergraduate thesis from a guy named Richard Evans Schultes. Some of you may know Dr. Schultes. He's sort of the father of ethnobotany, and he discovered a lot of the plants that are later became substrates for a lot of the drugs that we use that were derived from the Amazon. But before that, as an undergraduate, he went to Oklahoma, to the same part of the state where I grew up, and he studied peyote use among the indigenous people there. And they were using it ceremonially, as I mentioned, for a range of things that we would probably describe in sort of academic terms as being trauma-related conditions, right? But they were also using it for addiction, other uses along those lines. Then in the 1940s, Albert Hofmann sort of accidentally and famously discovered the psychedelic properties of LSD. He was a Swiss pharmacologist who accidentally dosed himself with a fairly high dose of LSD and had an experience that changed the course of his career. And he went on to study psychedelics the rest of his career. Alexander Shulgin is another. I don't want to belabor all these names, but I do think it's quite interesting that Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, who's also known before becoming Ram Dass was Richard Alpert. He's a Tufts grad, did his undergraduate here in psychology before doing a PhD at Stanford. And Timothy Leary and Ram Dass got very fascinated with LSD as well as psilocybin for a number of different reasons after experiencing them themselves. And I think of interest to me, in particular in this context, is one of the studies they did found that when you give psilocybin to people who are being released from prison, and allow them to sort of have this spiritual experience, they were calling it, they saw a 40% reduction in recidivism in these folks. And so there was quite a lot of activity happening around research of psychedelics in the 1960s. And this all sort of came to an end in the early 1970s due to a number of things. Part of it was this drug called thalidomide, which caused a lot of birth defects and led to a real crackdown on safety and really made drug development kind of slow in a lot of fields. You also had clinical trial design issues. We didn't really understand how the psychedelics were working, and the importance of this integration piece, which is basically like taking what a person has learned during their psychedelic experience and reinforcing it so that they take those lessons with them. But then perhaps the biggest factor was criminalization and the war on drugs, which really arbitrarily declared that all psychedelic plants were Schedule I and had no medicinal benefit. And the end result of that was that the academic and ultimately industry study of these compounds was stopped, right? So there was no federal funding for this, and it was the sort of hoops you had to jump through to study this in an academic setting or at a drug company were really stringent. And so next slide. What happened is that there was all this enthusiasm around the potential of these compounds went underground. And it wasn't until Rick Doblin in the mid-'80s established the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, that there was a real effort with private donations to try to move these things forward as therapies. Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London were also pioneers in this in the mid to late 90s. And next slide. The outcome of all of this was that we're now in an era where we've gotten enough data and enough studies have been done to see that psychedelic plants and psychedelic compounds, synthetic as well as naturally occurring, offer just dramatically different outcomes than any other therapy for trauma-related conditions. A list of some of the trials here that are ongoing and have been done are for PTSD, addiction, depression, anxiety, chronic pain. And what we're seeing in all of these studies, now the chronic pain studies are not complete and published yet, but in all these other conditions, we have phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trial data showing that with only 2 to 3 sessions in a therapeutic context. So the way these are given therapeutically is the patient or the person will take a dose of these compounds and basically have a window, a period of 6 to 8 hours where they experience the profound effects of these compounds. And during this time, the impact of the drugs is that it sort of, the way I like to describe it is it really softens the firewall, if you will, between the conscious and subconscious mind, and allows people to have access to memories and insights and things that are difficult to process otherwise. And another part of this is that these drugs really quiet the amygdala, which is sort of the seat of fear in the brain. And so it's this really beautiful, in my opinion, confluence of effects where you have the softening of fear, the ability to look inward and as well as to recall traumatic experiences, and then to really come to grips with moving forward from that trauma into a healthier state. And these compounds are also very relational, and so this happens in a therapeutic context with the therapist present. The last thing that these compounds do is they create a period of weeks to maybe a few months where the learnings that you've gotten during the insights can be internalized, and we call it neuroplasticity, but the ability of the brain to integrate these learnings and to establish new patterns of behavior and thought is really profound. And so the end result is that in all of these trials, we're seeing after 2 to 3 sessions that the majority of patients who go through psychedelic-assisted therapy for all of these conditions no longer meet the clinical criteria for diagnosis of PTSD or depression, anxiety, even a year after their last treatment. So, from a drug development standpoint, this is really fascinating. From the standpoint of providing equitable access to populations who are disproportionately impacted by trauma, in particular refugees, migrants, I think it presents some really interesting problems, but maybe some solvable problems too. The FDA compounds and the therapies that will go with this are going to be quite expensive. Necessarily, clinical trials cost a lot of money, tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars to take a drug to market. And the cost for treatment for one person to go through a psychedelic-assisted therapy with an FDA-approved compound will probably be it will certainly be in the thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars per patient, which, as you can imagine, really takes it out of the reach of people who are not really privileged, right? And have access to healthcare and resources. An interesting, I think, potential place where we can possibly find inroads to equitable access is that these compounds are naturally occurring, and you can literally grow them in your garden, right? So it's not like a synthetic compound that has to be made in the lab and has to go through a certain process. And with the exception of ibogaine, most of these compounds are extremely safe. And so there are a lot of moves right now toward decriminalization. There's an organization called Decriminalize Nature, which is promoting safe use. A lot of cities, including Somerville, Cambridge, and cities across the country have decriminalized locally psychedelic plants and naturally occurring psychedelics. And there are also some really interesting initiatives from groups like Chacruna Institute who are advocating for access more widely. Obviously, there are certainly questions of, if you do have access, how can you ensure reliable dosing and safe compounds that are not adulterated and things like that. And those are not trivial, but I think all in all, there's a lot of hope and a lot of promise. And I think that certainly refugees and other displaced people, folks who have really been impacted by trauma, could potentially really be impacted by this, and it could really help them integrate. And so I'm curious and also very excited to be a part of trying to find a solution to these, providing access to these tools safely and effectively for folks. So that's my talk, and I don't know if we can go to the next slide just for questions. Any question? Thank you all. Oh, sure. No, that's all right.
We're all absorbing this. It's
I gotcha.
interesting. It's just fascinating, and I wonder, thank you, if you can say anything about whether some of these initiatives that you're trying to increase access to these potential therapies are in place for refugees and migrants, or in poorer communities.
Yes.
Can you say a bit more about that?
There's certainly a lot of groups who are looking at trying to, impact the groups disproportionately impacted by trauma, and this includes the unhoused and a lot of different veterans, right, as well as frontline workers, right, who during COVID have really been impacted by the trauma of dealing with all the COVID crisis, right. There are a lot of initiatives looking at, more broadly trying to advocate for, increasing, just starting with conversations, right? Let's be talking about this. Let's get the, these conversations going and really make sure that we make wise decisions as we move forward, and don't, put this solely as an expensive drug on a, on a pharmacist shelf, right? One of the things that I'm most excited about is many of you know Caitlin Roberson, my partner, and she's trained and works in the migrant and refugee space. She is going to be founding with me Cacti Therapeutics, which is a natural derived psychedelics company, and really it's going to be a social impact venture, which is promoting exactly these initiatives, right? So really trying to make sure that that refugees are not last in line for these therapies. So, yeah. Not at this point, right? So what we're planning to do at Cacti Therapeutics is still very early stage. We've been talking with some of the public and private psychedelics companies that are doing some of the FDA trials to really just have those conversations early. I know Caitlin has had some conversations with folks that do work in refugee camps around this, and it'll be interesting to see how international law addresses these matters as well. I mean, you could imagine that if you have a reliably dosed compound that's naturally derived and not patented, that it could be distributed quite inexpensively, and of course then you still need this essential therapeutic piece, right? And yet at the same time, it's not, I think, quite as it's not quite as onerous as it might be if we're talking about a therapy that has to be done in person, in a clinical setting, right? So I think there are ways that you could potentially use, for example, digital tools for the integration work if you had, could provide safe access in, for example, like in refugee camps. And obviously this is a big project. It's a lot of work to do, a lot of unanswered questions, but that's a fantastic one. Yeah, yes.
I'm wondering if in your research, it's been at all important the degree to which patients have a shared understanding of what the origin of this distress is. Mm-hmm. So, one thing that I think a lot about is what someone's cultural formulation of their distress is. Yeah. Are they depressed because of a shared understanding of what the doctor is saying is making them depressed? Does someone believe that they're carrying a burden for sins of their ancestors? Does someone see that the origin of their PTSD is the same as a practitioner might see it? And so I'm curious, and I have a sense of how well those things work through therapy, but I'm curious with drugs, if you've seen it all in the research, whether, there needs to really be a shared agreement about, this is a problem that can be treated with a medication, and are you seeing different outcomes relative to that as we think about diverse understandings of what the origin of distress may be in different migrant communities?
No, that's a great question, and it's really quite fascinating. Most patients who have the most impact, the best outcomes, do express that they were able to identify and pinpoint certain distressing events or ruminations around their integration. Sometimes the distress can be related more to a fear of around the reintegration. We see this in veterans, right, where it's more the trauma doesn't present itself until they return, and then suddenly there's this not dissociation. There's just a real difficulty in reintegrating, for the veterans. But it doesn't seem to be a requirement, right, that they have this, and that's probably most evident in animal models, right? So in rodent models of depression, rodent models of addiction, we can give these same compounds, and we can't say for sure whether what they're thinking and what their experience is, but it works in rodent models as well, right? So I don't know that a really concrete and well-defined conceptualization of the problem therefore is necessary. But that's a really great point. And I do want to reiterate that the patients that have the best outcomes typically do point to defined insights, right, that they can move forward from. Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I have about 3 questions all muddled
Sure.
together, but I suppose one would be just to hear a little bit more about the response to what probably many of us in the room would call big pharma to some of this research, and maybe to your own endeavors as well.
Yeah.
And then maybe a bit going along with the question that was just asked, kind of are there issues or challenges, or how do you approach the fact that some of these medicines were used in a particular environment often, and obviously not always? And I guess the backup is I have a sibling that studies ayahuasca and sort of traditional use, and I know that there's a lot of kind of worry in some communities around how it's being handled outside of ceremony and so on.
Great questions. The approach from the pharmaceutical industry, I would say, is there are 2 main efforts, going forward. One is simply to take the existing compounds and to get federal approval for their use for a particular diagnosis, right? And then to build new treatment paradigms around the drug, right? So in the case of psilocybin, we're talking about like a 6-hour therapeutic window. So a patient would come in early in the morning. They would have a psychiatrist as well as a psychologist present for about 8 hours of the session. And then they would stay with them until the evening, and then come back the next day for integration work and periodic integration for a few weeks thereafter. That doesn't fit very well with our Western sort of delivery systems, right? So the idea of two trained caregivers or therapists staying with one client all day long is costly and not a good fit for the way we currently do things. And so one of the biggest efforts, I would say, across the board with the various companies that have been publicly and privately funded, looking at taking and adapting these medicines for our systems, is efforts where they're trying to make them very short acting, right? So you could go in to your therapist and have a 1-hour session and drive home the same day, right? And so those are the kinds of efforts that are ongoing. I'm quite confident they will be able to engineer that property into synthetics, right? Duration of action is something that we can pretty reliably tweak and make drugs act shorter or longer. And so that's a solvable, I should say, problem. But getting to your second point, I think there has to be a certain, or at least I just intrinsically, I have a real deep respect for the way these plants evolved with people, and that their use co-evolved, right? And that I suspect that we're going to be losing something if we, just try to take and tweak part of this for our own uses, right? And that there's a lot to be learned from the indigenous uses and the shaman and the spiritual practitioners who have been using these, for a long time. A lot of these practitioners in the U.S. have been, doing this in under a shroud of secrecy, and some of them, if licensed, have put their licenses at risk to try to, work with patients that they felt like could really benefit from these approaches. And so, my fear is that we will have only these short-acting synthetic compounds, and that people will still have to leave, for example, in the US, still have to leave our, cross borders to go get the original plant-based medicines, right? And I think that would be a real tragedy, and just a real cultural wrong as well, right? And there are groups, though, however, there's a group called Journey Collab that's funded by some tech venture funds, and they have a real eye to try to preserve the natural use of these compounds and to bring them into to make them available to patients in Western societies, right? And there's some interesting ideas as to how you might do that, but ultimately I do think that at the end of the day, returning these medicines to their indigenous custodians, the folks who have really, carried their use and their traditions for, hundreds and thousands of years, is going to be really important, that we listen to them and that we work with them to make these medicines available to as many people as can benefit. So other questions? Yeah. And I want to, I'm over here by about 12 minutes. So I don't want.
We can do questions on the side, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, let's do that, because I don't want to slow things down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ruby. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating topic, and we're glad that there is so much interest. But we are going to move on to our next panel.